Elliot had heard of Randonautica before, the app that sent people to random coordinates, sometimes leading them to eerie places, sometimes giving them an inexplicable experience. He never believed in all that supernatural nonsense. It was just an algorithm, a game, a way to kill boredom. That's what he told himself when he convinced his best friend, Mason, and his girlfriend, Ava, to try it out. The night was cold, the sky overcast with thick, unmoving clouds. The three of them huddled together in Mason's old Jeep, parked on the outskirts of town. The town of Black Hollow didn't have much in terms of excitement, so when Elliot suggested they use Randonautica to find something interesting, Ava had hesitated. "What if we end up in the middle of the woods or in someone's backyard?" she'd asked. Mason, ever the skeptic, had laughed. "Worst case scenario, we end up at some abandoned barn. Big deal." Elliot had typed in their intention, something truly unexplainable. The app processed their request, the spinning wheel on the screen slowing to a stop. A set of coordinates appeared, less than 10 miles away. "Let's go," Elliot said, grinning. Mason pulled out onto the road, heading toward their first adventure. As they drove, the houses thinned, replaced by dense trees on either side of the road. The GPS led them down a narrow dirt path that barely looked drivable. "This is how horror movies start," Ava muttered, arms crossed. Mason didn't slow down. The Jeep jolted over roots and uneven ground until, finally, they arrived. The destination, an overgrown clearing with a crumbling, graffiti-covered shack in the center. Ava hesitated, gripping Elliot's arm. "No way, that place screams 'do not enter.'" Mason, already out of the car, clicked on his flashlight. "It's just an old shed," he said, "probably filled with rusty tools and broken furniture." Elliot, fueled by curiosity, followed. The air was thick, unmoving, wrong. Even the insects had gone silent. He pushed open the rotting wooden door, his breath hitching as he stepped inside. The shack smelled of mildew and decay. Dust particles swirled in the dim light as Elliot's flashlight swept across the room. A table stood in the center, covered in old, crumbling papers. Mason picked one up, squinting at the faded ink. "Looks like coordinates?" He frowned. "And dates, but they're decades old." Ava stood at the doorway, refusing to step inside. "We should go," she whispered. Elliot wasn't listening. His eyes had locked onto something else, a stack of Polaroid photos, yellowed with age. He picked one up. The image was blurry, but he could just make out a figure standing in the woods, staring directly at the camera. A chill ran down his spine. He flipped through more. Each one had a different person, but they all shared the same eerie detail. A shadowy figure lurking in the background, always closer, always watching. Then Mason swore under his breath. "Elliot, look at the last date on this list." Elliot turned, scanning the page Mason held. His blood ran cold. The last entry wasn't old, it was recent. Yesterday's date. And the coordinates? They matched this exact location. Ava gasped. "Did you hear that? A rustling sound. Close. Too close." Elliot's stomach twisted as a shadow shifted beyond the doorway. Not an animal, not the wind. Something else was out there. Elliot's breath hitched as the rustling outside the shack grew louder. Ava stumbled back toward the Jeep, eyes wide with terror. "We have to go. Now." Mason's flashlight flickered as he turned toward the sound. "Probably just an animal," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Elliot swallowed hard. The air in the shack felt heavy, suffocating. His fingers tightened around the stack of Polaroids as he flipped to the last one, the most recent. His heart nearly stopped. The image showed the shack, their shack, but there was something new in the photo, something that hadn't been there when they arrived. A dark figure stood just outside the door, staring inward. His stomach twisted. He turned the photo over. Scrawled in messy handwriting were the words, "Do not look for it." Ava screamed. Elliot spun, nearly dropping the photo. Outside in the tree line something was moving, a shape barely visible in the darkness. Tall, unnaturally still. Mason backed up toward the Jeep, grabbing Ava's wrist. "We're leaving. Right now." Elliot's legs felt locked in place. The figure, whatever it was, stood completely motionless just beyond the glow of their flashlights. His instincts screamed at him to run, but something deeper, something primal, kept him rooted in place. It wasn't just a shadow. It wasn't a person. It was wrong. Then it moved. A single step forward. The flashlight beam flickered as if the air itself had thickened, warping the light. Mason yanked Elliot's arm. "Get in the car. Get in the goddamn car." Finally, Elliot's body obeyed. He turned and bolted, diving into the back seat as Mason threw the Jeep into reverse, tires spinning against the dirt. Ava was shaking beside him, her nails digging into his arm. "It followed us," she whispered. Elliot dared a glance out the back window. The shack was shrinking into the distance, swallowed by the dark. But the figure, it was still there. No movement, no expression, just watching. Mason drove like a madman, jerking the wheel as they skidded back onto the main road. "What the hell was that?" he snapped, knuckles white against the steering wheel. Elliot's mind raced. The photos, the dates, the coordinates. Someone, or something, had been keeping records of this place, of them. "I don't know," he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "But I think someone knew we'd come." Ava shook her head violently. "That's insane. It's just some creep trying to scare people." Mason didn't look convinced. Then why did it just stand there? Why did it feel? He trailed off, shuddering. "Wrong," Elliot finished. Silence filled the car, thick and uneasy. The roads were empty, the night pressing in on all sides. Then the radio crackled. All three of them jumped as static hissed through the speakers, cutting through the quiet. Mason fumbled with the dials. "What the hell?" A voice, distorted, low, whispered through the static. Not words, not exactly, just sounds, breathing. A rasping, hollow exhale. Then, click. The radio shut off completely. No one spoke. Mason pressed harder on the gas, the speedometer creeping higher. The town lights were still miles away, but at that moment they felt impossibly far. Elliot stole another glance out the window. His blood turned to ice. There, standing just beyond the trees, keeping pace with the car, was the figure, watching, following. Mason didn't stop driving until they reached the edge of town, tires screeching as he pulled into the empty parking lot of an all-night diner. The Jeep rumbled as he threw it into park, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles looked bloodless. For a long moment, none of them spoke. Ava was shaking, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Elliot could hear his own heartbeat hammering in his chest. He turned, staring out the window toward the road they had come from, half expecting to see that thing standing there beneath the flickering streetlights. But the road was empty. Mason exhaled sharply and ran a hand down his face. What the hell just happened? Ava turned on him, voice raw. "We were followed, Mason. Something, I don't know what, was out there, watching us. It wasn't human." Elliot gripped the stack of Polaroids tighter. He could still feel the weight of the last one, the one with the shack, the one with it. Slowly, he pulled the photo from the stack and held it up in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. His stomach twisted. The image had changed. The shadowy figure, once a distant shape near the trees, was closer. Almost pressed against the shack's doorway now, its face, or whatever it had in place of one, turned directly toward the camera. Ava's breath hitched as she leaned over to look. "That's not possible." Elliot swallowed hard. "It's moving." Mason turned and yanked the photo from Elliot's grip. "That's bullshit," he snapped. But his bravado faltered the second he saw it. The blood drained from his face. Ava whimpered. What if it's still following us?" Elliot's skin prickled. He didn't want to look outside again. Didn't want to check the shadows, but his fingers twitched toward the door handle anyway. "I need to get some air," he muttered. "Elliot." Ava reached for him, but he was already stepping out of the car. The night was thick and quiet, the air tinged with the scent of damp pavement and old fryer grease from the diner. The neon sign buzzed overhead, flickering every few seconds. He turned in slow circles, scanning the parking lot, the road beyond it, the tree line that loomed just outside the reach of the streetlights. Nothing, he exhaled. Maybe they'd just imagined it. Maybe. A noise. A soft ticking sound. Elliot's entire body went rigid. He turned slowly toward the Jeep. Ava and Mason were still inside, but their faces had gone pale with horror. Ava raised a trembling hand and pointed. Not at Elliot. Behind him. His blood turned to ice. He could feel it now. That suffocating presence, the thick weight of something standing impossibly close. He didn't want to turn around, but he had to. Every nerve in his body screamed, "Run!" But his feet remained rooted in place as he turned. There, standing just at the edge of the lot, was the figure. It was closer than ever before. The streetlight above it flickered violently, casting jagged shadows across its form. And for the first time, Elliot saw its eyes. Empty, hollow, not human. It didn't move, didn't breathe, just watched. Then in a slow, deliberate motion, it raised one hand, palm up, fingers curled, beckoning. Elliot's breath came in ragged bursts. He felt something deep inside him twist, something primal screaming at him to move, to look away. Then the diner lights flickered off. For a single, suffocating second, the world plunged into darkness. And when the lights came back on, the figure was gone. Elliot stumbled backward, slamming into the Jeep. Mason threw open the door and yanked him inside. "We're leaving, right now." He didn't argue. None of them did. Mason peeled out of the lot, the Jeep roaring as they sped down the road, past the neon glow of the diner, past the empty streets. No one spoke. No one looked back. But Elliot knew. This wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The ride back to Mason's house was a blur. No one spoke, and the silence felt louder than any scream could have. The air in the Jeep was thick with tension, with fear, with the unshakable feeling that they were being watched. Mason parked in his driveway, but no one moved to get out. Ava was gripping her knees, rocking slightly, whispering to herself. Elliot sat stiffly, gripping the Polaroids so tightly that the edges had begun to curl beneath his fingers. Mason finally broke the silence. "We should burn them." Elliot snapped his head toward him. "What?" "The photos," Mason said, swallowing hard. "If they're connected to that thing, we should destroy them. Maybe it'll break whatever the hell this is." Ava nodded shakily. "I don't care what we do with them. I just want it to stop." Elliot hesitated. His gut told him it wasn't that simple. It wasn't just about the photos. It wasn't just about the shack. This thing had found them. And the Polaroids? They were just proof. Still, he said nothing as Mason grabbed a lighter from his backpack and stepped out of the Jeep. They followed him to the backyard, where he piled the photos into a rusted metal fire pit and flicked the lighter. The flame danced for a second before catching. The fire crackled, swallowing the Polaroids one by one, their edges curling and blackening. Ava let out a shaky breath. "That's it, right? We're done?" Elliot watched the last photo shrivel and turn to ash, the one that had changed, the one where the figure had drawn closer. For the first time that night, he felt something close to relief. Maybe Mason was right. Maybe. The backyard lights flickered off. Ava gasped. Mason swore under his breath. Then from the trees beyond the yard, something clicked. A single sharp sound, like a camera shutter snapping. Then again, and again. Elliot's chest constricted. He turned slowly, his body trembling with the effort to move. The tree line was just darkness, stretching on into nothing. But the air felt thick, suffocating. And then the flash. A bright burst of white light flickered in the woods, like the flash of a camera. Then another, then another. The clicking sound returned, faster now, almost frantic. Ava whimpered, backing toward the house. Mason grabbed Elliot's arm. Inside. Now. They bolted. Mason barely had time to slam the door shut before something slammed against it from the other side. Ava screamed. Elliot stumbled backward. Mason locked it, hands shaking. Silence. Nothing moved. No clicking, no flashing lights, just the heavy weight of their breathing. Then Mason's phone buzzed. They all jumped. Mason fumbled for it, his fingers barely managing to hold onto the device. When he looked at the screen, his face drained of color. Elliot's stomach twisted. "What is it?" Mason swallowed hard and turned the phone so they could see. A new photo. The timestamp showed it had been taken just seconds ago. And the image, it was them. Standing in the backyard, staring at the fire pit, and behind them, only feet away, the figure. Closer than ever. The phone slipped from Mason's fingers and clattered to the floor. Ava sobbed. "It's inside." Elliot turned, breath shallow, heart hammering. The house was silent. But something was in here with them. A shadow flickered in the hallway. A single, slow step, then another. The temperature in the room plummeted, the air thick with something unnatural. Mason reached for the fireplace poker. Ava grabbed a kitchen knife. Elliot, he wasn't sure what to do. His mind was frozen, blank, overwhelmed by the sheer wrongness of it all. Then, the lights flickered back on. And just like that, the presence was gone. The house was still, silent. The only thing left behind was Mason's phone. The screen had changed. The message was different now. Just 3 words. "You found me." The police didn't believe them. No signs of forced entry. No footprints. No evidence. They left town the next morning. All of them. No goodbyes. No explanations. They never spoke about it again. But sometimes late at night, Elliot still hears it. The soft, rhythmic clicking, like a camera, taking photos. and every time he looks, the shadows seem just a little bit closer. It started as a joke. A harmless, thrill-seeking adventure on a crisp autumn night, the kind of thing 20-somethings did when boredom settled in like a thick fog. Noah, Jess, and Lucas sat in Noah's car, parked beneath a flickering streetlight on the outskirts of town. The Randonautica app glowed on Jess's phone, casting an eerie blue light on her face. "Okay, guys," she said, biting her lip. "I set the intent to something disturbing. Let's see where it takes us." Lucas chuckled nervously from the back seat. "Disturbing? You sure that's a good idea?" Jess rolled her eyes. "Come on, Lucas, that's the whole point. We want something spooky." Noah, always the skeptic, adjusted his rearview mirror and smirked. "Right, because an app is totally going to lead us to some haunted house or whatever." But when Jess hit generate coordinates, something changed in the atmosphere. The air in the car grew heavier, the way it does before a thunderstorm, and the streetlight above them buzzed loudly, flickering twice before plunging them into darkness. A single notification popped up on Jess's screen. Coordinates set. Travel 5.3 miles northwest. They hesitated for a moment. The unease was subtle but undeniable, creeping in like a whisper in the back of their minds. But none of them wanted to back down. They had driven out here for a reason, and turning around now would be admitting defeat. "All right," Noah said, starting the car. "Let's see where the hell this thing takes us." The drive was uneventful at first. They left the city behind, the streetlights giving way to stretches of dark, empty road. The GPS directed them onto a winding gravel path surrounded by dense woods. Tall, skeletal trees reached over the road like gnarled fingers, their bare branches rattling in the wind. Jess leaned forward, squinting at her phone. "This doesn't make sense. The pin is kind of in the middle of nowhere." Lucas frowned. "You mean like private property?" "No," she said slowly, "just nowhere." The car's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead. They passed an old rusted gate hanging open on its hinges, the kind that should have been locked. Beyond it, the road turned into little more than a dirt path, riddled with potholes. Maybe we should turn around," Lucas muttered. But Noah, emboldened by Jess's excitement, pressed on. "We've come this far. Let's just see what's there." Minutes passed in silence, save for the crunch of gravel beneath the tires. Then, without warning, the app spoke for the first time, a robotic voice slicing through the quiet. "You have arrived at your destination." The car rolled to a stop. Ahead of them, bathed in the car's high beams, was an abandoned house. It sat at the end of the dirt road, a decaying relic swallowed by the woods. The windows were shattered, the roof sagging in places, and the front door hung slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. Vines crawled up the siding, reclaiming the structure as part of the forest. Jess exhaled sharply. "Holy shit!" Noah drummed his fingers against the steering wheel. "It's probably just some old hunting cabin." "Or a murder house," Lucas muttered. Something about the place felt wrong, profoundly wrong, like it had been forgotten by time but not entirely abandoned. There was an energy to it, something watching. Jess was the first to move. She grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and pushed the door open. "Come on. We didn't drive all the way out here to chicken out now." Noah sighed and followed, while Lucas hesitated before reluctantly stepping out. The air was colder than it should have been, the wind carrying a faint, rotting smell. As they approached the house, the creaking door swung open on its own. Lucas stopped dead in his tracks. Nope, we are not going in there." But Jess, emboldened by adrenaline, stepped over the threshold, her flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. "Guys, you need to see this." Inside, the walls were covered in pages. Hundreds of them. Newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and photographs, all pinned in a chaotic, frenzied pattern. Some were faded with age, others newer. Noah stepped closer, his eyes scanning the words scribbled in red ink. They repeated over and over, filling the room like a desperate chant. "You were brought here for a reason." Then, from the corner of the room, something moved. A shadow, too tall and too thin, lurking just beyond the beam of Jess's flashlight. And then it spoke. Not in a voice, but in a whisper, inside their heads. "You shouldn't have come." The flashlight flickered, and the door slammed shut behind them. Lucas screamed first. Not a loud, dramatic yell, but a strangled sound, like his throat had closed around his fear. Jess whirled around, her flashlight shaking in her grip, the beam bouncing wildly off the wall of words. Noah lunged at the door, his body slamming against the old wood, rattling the hinges. It wouldn't budge. What the hell was that? Lucas hissed, pressing himself against the far wall. Jess's breathing was ragged. The room felt smaller, like the walls were inching closer, squeezing them into an impossible space. It spoke, she stammered. Noah pounded on the door, his fists slamming against the wood. It didn't speak. It was a trick. This whole place is a trick. Then they heard it. A sound that sent a cold wire of terror through each of them. Scraping. Something long and sharp dragging across the floor upstairs. Slow, deliberate movements. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Jess flicked her flashlight up, catching the narrow staircase at the far side of the room. The railing was cracked, splintered, covered in deep gouges, like something had raked its nails down the wood. "We need to get out of here," Lucas whispered. Noah stepped back from the door, his chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. He turned, grabbed an old wooden chair, and raised it high. "Stand back." Jess barely had time to move before Noah swung it hard against the door. The impact sent a deafening crack through the house, but the door didn't break. It didn't even shake. It was solid, like it was part of the foundation itself, like it had never been meant to open once closed. Noah staggered back, his face pale. That should have worked. Scrape. The sound upstairs grew closer. Jess turned sharply, her flashlight trembling in her grip. She aimed it at the stairwell, and for a split second, something was there, something watching. A figure, not quite human, but too close to be anything else. Its limbs were wrong, too long, its head tilted unnaturally to one side, and its mouth, oh God, its mouth was stretched open wide, wider than any human mouth should be. And then in the silence it giggled. A childlike sound that didn't belong inside an abandoned house in the middle of the woods. Jess's blood ran cold. "We need to move. Now." Lucas was already scrambling toward a second door, half hidden beneath tattered wallpaper. A basement entrance. No, that's a horrible idea," Jess hissed. "And staying here isn't?" Noah snapped. The scraping sound grew louder. It was descending the stairs. Noah lunged for the basement door, his fingers curling around the rusted handle. It stuck at first, swollen with age, but with one desperate yank, it tore open. Jess hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. "We don't know what's down there." "We don't know what's up here either." Lucas shoved her forward. Jess stumbled, nearly falling as she plunged down the wooden stairs, Noah and Lucas right behind her. The second they hit the concrete floor, Noah yanked the door shut, pressing his back against it. Above them, something rushed forward, a sickening thud against the wood, followed by the sound of long, brittle fingernails dragging down the surface. Jess's flashlight flickered. The basement was smaller than expected, just a single room with stone walls and a dirt floor. The air was thick, damp, too heavy to breathe properly. Then she saw it. In the far corner of the room, a trapdoor. Noah followed her gaze. Another way out. Lucas didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, fingers digging into the rusted handle, but the second he touched it, his face contorted in pain. Fuck. He jerked back, clutching his hand. Blood bloomed across his palm. The trapdoor had been wired shut. Jess crouched beside him. The wound wasn't deep, but something about it looked wrong, like the metal itself had bitten into his skin, leaving behind blackened edges. Noah ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. Okay, we just need..." His voice trailed off. The scraping stopped. Everything went silent. Too silent. Then, from directly behind them, the whisper returned. "You were brought here for a reason." Lucas's head snapped up. That wasn't coming from upstairs." Jess's flashlight flickered out. For a split second, the basement was plunged into total darkness. Then, in the pitch-black silence, something breathed. Jess froze. The breath was deep and wet, like something exhaling through lungs that hadn't been used in a long, long time. It was close, too close, the sound curling around them in the darkness. "Don't move." Noah's whisper was barely audible, but it carried the weight of a desperate command. Lucas was shaking. Jess could feel it, even in the dark. He was hyperventilating, his breath shallow and erratic. If he panicked now, they were dead. Then, movement. Not footsteps, something dragging itself across the dirt floor. Slow, deliberate. Jess gripped Noah's arm, her fingers digging into his skin. "We have to get out of here," she mouthed. Noah nodded. He reached blindly, his fingers brushing the rusted wire holding the trapdoor shut. The metal was cold, unnaturally so, but he didn't hesitate. Lucas whimpered. Jess's heart nearly stopped. The breathing halted. Then, a sudden, violent screech. The thing in the dark moved fast. Faster than anything should in a crawl space. Jess felt something graze her ankle, a sharp, icy touch that sent a jolt of raw terror through her body. She kicked out violently, connecting with something solid. Noah ripped at the wires, tearing at them with his bare hands. The metal bit deep, slicing into his fingers, but he didn't stop. Didn't dare stop. "Hurry the hell up," Lucas gasped. Then the flashlight flickered back on. Jess wished it hadn't. Because for the first time, she saw it. It was inches away. The thing was wrong. A human shape but distorted, stretched too thin, its skin like paper, peeling and shifting as it moved. Its mouth was open, revealing a gaping black hole, as if its jaw had unhinged. But its eyes, God, its eyes. There weren't any. Just dark, empty sockets sunken into its skeletal face. And yet, Jess knew it was looking at her. "Move," Noah roared. The last of the wires snapped and the trapdoor swung open, revealing a pitch-black tunnel below. No time to think. Jess shoved Lucas forward and he dropped into the abyss. Noah grabbed her wrist and yanked her down with him. They fell into pure darkness, swallowed by the earth. Above them, the thing screamed. The trapdoor slammed shut. They landed hard. Jess hit the ground on her side, the wind knocked from her lungs. Noah landed next to her with a painful grunt, while Lucas gasped for air, clutching his bleeding hand. The space was tight, like a tunnel, but it wasn't natural. The walls were made of rough stone, slick with moisture. The air was thick, carrying the scent of something damp and rotting. Where the hell are we?" Lucas rasped. Noah pushed himself up, panting. "I don't know, but we're not staying." Jess fumbled for her flashlight. The second she turned it on, her stomach dropped. The walls were covered in carvings, hundreds of them. Symbols, words in a language she didn't recognize. And in the center, something worse. A row of human teeth embedded into the stone, arranged in a twisted, smiling shape. Jess staggered back. "This isn't a tunnel," she whispered. "It's a tomb." Noah turned sharply, his jaw clenched. "Then we need to move. Now." Lucas wasn't listening. He was staring at the far end of the tunnel, his face drained of color. "Guys, there's something down here." Jess followed his gaze, and her blood ran ice cold. At the end of the passage, a figure stood perfectly still, not the same thing from before. This was something else. It looked human, but only in the way a mannequin resembles a person. Its face was featureless, its body motionless. But then, its head twisted toward them. No movement, no steps, just a sudden, impossible turn of its head. And then, in a voice that wasn't a voice, it spoke. "You were brought here for a reason." The same words from the house. Jess's heart pounded violently against her ribs. Lucas snapped. He turned and bolted down the tunnel. Noah grabbed Jess's wrist. "Run!" They ran. Hard, fast, blindly. The tunnel twisted and turned, the carvings blurring past them. Lucas was ahead, panting, sobbing. Then, a split second too late, Jess realized he was running toward a ledge. "Lucas, stop!" But he was already falling. Noah lunged, grabbing his arm at the last second. Lucas dangled over the edge, his feet kicking into empty air. Jess fell to her knees, gripping Noah's shoulder. Below them, the pit was endless, a yawning, black abyss that seemed to stretch into forever. But what made Jess's stomach lurch was the fact that it wasn't empty. Something was looking up at them. A mass of figures, standing in the darkness. Too far to see clearly, but close enough that she knew. They were watching. Waiting. Lucas sobbed. "Please, don't let me fall." Noah clenched his jaw, pulling him up inch by inch, but behind them, the figure was coming. It didn't walk. It simply moved, its head twitching with every step. Jess's flashlight flickered. "Noah, hurry!" Noah gave one final yank, and Lucas collapsed onto solid ground, gasping for air. Then, the tunnel shook violently. A low rumble echoed through the stone walls, dust raining from the ceiling. The figure stopped. Jess felt it. A shift in the air. Something worse was coming. Then, from deep below, a sound rose from the abyss. A sound that made Jess's bones turn to ice. A chorus of voices, hundreds of them, whispering, chanting, calling for them. And then, the ground beneath them cracked. The ground gave way beneath them. Jess barely had time to scream before she was falling, Lucas and Noah tumbling beside her. The tunnel, the carvings, the figure standing at the edge, all of it vanished into the dark. They hit the ground hard. Jess landed on her back, pain bursting through her ribs. The wind was knocked from her lungs. Noah groaned somewhere to her left, while Lucas let out a weak, wheezing sob. The air was different down here. It wasn't just damp. It was thick, heavy, like they had been swallowed by something alive. Jess forced herself up, her head pounding. Noah was already moving, clutching his shoulder, his face pale. Lucas wasn't responding. Jess's stomach turned to ice as she crawled toward him. He was on his side, curled into himself, his breath shallow. "Lucas," she whispered, shaking him. He didn't move. His eyes were open, locked onto something past her, unblinking. Then, in the silence, he spoke. "I see them." Jess whipped around, and finally, she understood. What was beneath the house? What had been calling them? The cavern stretched endlessly. The flashlight beam barely touched the walls, but scattered across the floor, dozens of figures stood motionless in the dark. Not alive, not statues, something worse. They were people, or at least they had been. Their bodies were brittle, calcified, their skin turned to stone, mouths frozen in silent screams. And at the center of them all, something waited. It wasn't human. It had never been human. A twisted shape loomed in the darkness, a thing that should not exist. Its limbs stretched into the cavern walls like it had grown out of the stone itself. Its head was wrong, elongated, shifting, as if it couldn't decide on a shape. But its eyes, they were filled with faces, dozens of them. Twisting, moving, screaming silently, trapped. Noah gagged, staggering back. What the fuck? What the fuck is that? Jess's mind refused to understand. Lucas was smiling. "It's been waiting," he whispered. Jess turned to him, her pulse slamming against her ribs. "What the hell are you talking about?" Lucas's eyes were changing, darkening, his pupils expanding until they swallowed everything. "I see them now," he whispered. "I know why we were brought here." Noah grabbed him, shaking him violently. "Snap the fuck out of it." Lucas just stared into the dark, his lips parting into a wider grin. And the thing shifted. It moved. Not toward them, but inside them. Jess felt it, a weight in her skull, a whisper slithering through her mind. "Join us," she screamed, clutching her head. Noah did too, stumbling back, his hands shaking. Lucas didn't fight it. He stepped forward. Jess lunged, grabbing his arm. "Lucas, no." He turned to her, and his eyes were gone. Just black pits, endless and hollow. "It's okay," he said softly. "I understand now." Jess's throat closed with terror. No, you don't." But it was too late. Lucas let go, and something reached for him. Jess screamed. Noah yanked her back just as the thing pulled Lucas into the dark. His body twisted, his face vanished, and then he was gone. Absorbed, swallowed. One more face in the endless void. The whisper faded. The weight in Jess's skull lifted. She gasped, her body shaking uncontrollably. Noah's voice was hoarse. "We need to get the fuck out of here." Jess couldn't move. Lucas was gone. No, not just gone. Erased. As if he had never existed. Noah grabbed her wrist and hauled her forward. "Jess, move!" She forced herself to run. Through the cavern. Through the forest of frozen bodies. The thing didn't follow, because it didn't need to. It had already won. 1 week later, Jess sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her phone. The Randonautica app was still open. The last coordinates were still there. The place where Lucas had disappeared. Noah refused to talk about it. He barely spoke at all. The police hadn't found anything. No footprints. No bodies. No Lucas. Jess had called his family. They had answered with confusion. "Lucas," his mother had said. "I don't know a Lucas." Jess had dropped her phone, because she had seen it in her call history. Every text, every message, every photo, all of them were gone. No records, no proof. Lucas had been wiped away, like he had never existed. Jess pressed her hands against her face, her breath coming in short, broken gasps. Then, a notification popped up. A new set of coordinates. Her stomach twisted violently, because beneath them, a message appeared. "You were brought here for a reason." Jess's phone slipped from her fingers. And somewhere, in the dark corners of her mind, she heard Lucas whispering. It started as a joke, a drunken idea between friends on a stormy Friday night. The Randonautica app, an urban legend in itself, promising eerie and inexplicable experiences based on randomized coordinates. Most stories floating around online were harmless. Kids stumbling upon abandoned buildings or hidden trails, nothing more. But there were darker stories too. Missing persons cases, strange figures appearing in the woods, unexplainable noises. Those were the stories that piqued Caleb's interest. "Come on, dude. It's all algorithms and random points on a map," Ethan scoffed, slouched on Caleb's worn-out couch. His hoodie was pulled over his head, shielding him from the flickering light above. "It's a gimmick. You really think some app is gonna send us to a real-life horror movie?" Caleb grinned, fingers already tapping on his phone. Only one way to find out. He toggled through the settings, choosing their intention, something disturbing. The moment he pressed confirm, the screen glitched. A brief second of static and white noise before spitting out coordinates a few miles outside town, deep into the wooded outskirts. Maya, the only girl in the group, shuddered. "That's near Blackwood Creek. People say there used to be a settlement out there in the 1800s, but everyone either died or disappeared." She shot Caleb a glare. "You did this on purpose, didn't you?" Caleb just shrugged. "No idea what you're talking about. But hey, we wanted creepy. We got creepy." An hour later, they were packed into Ethan's battered sedan, headlights cutting through the thickening mist as they navigated winding back roads. The further they drove, the quieter it became. No passing cars, no streetlights. Just the looming shadow of the forest, trees standing like silent watchers. "Phone signal's dead," Ethan muttered. He glanced at Caleb, who was still glued to the map on his screen. "How much further?" "Half a mile," Caleb replied. His voice was quieter now, a small thread of uncertainty creeping in. The location was unmarked off the main roads, and as they drove, the forest seemed to swallow them whole, the outside world fading behind layers of fog and darkness. Then, the car engine sputtered. The dashboard lights flickered once, then went black. The vehicle lurched, rolling to a slow, agonizing stop. "You've got to be kidding me," Ethan hissed, turning the key. Nothing. They were stranded, miles from civilization, and they hadn't even reached the coordinates yet. Ethan swore under his breath and tried the ignition again. The engine clicked uselessly, refusing to turn over. Caleb pulled out his phone, only to find his screen frozen, completely unresponsive. "Great," Maya muttered, hugging herself against the cold. "Stranded in the middle of nowhere. This is exactly how every horror movie starts." "Relax," Caleb said, though his voice lacked confidence. "It's just a coincidence. Maybe the battery's shot or something." Ethan smacked the steering wheel. "Dude, my car was fine before we left." His eyes flicked to the GPS. "We're only, half a mile away from the coordinates? Maybe we walk there, check it out, and head back. Someone will drive by eventually." Maya shook her head. "Or we stay put and wait for help." "I don't like this, Caleb. Something feels off." But Caleb's curiosity had already taken over. "We came this far," he said. "Might as well see what's out there." Reluctantly, Maya sighed and pushed open the door, stepping into the foggy night. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The three of them trudged along the narrow dirt path, flashlights cutting weak beams through the darkness. The deeper they went, the heavier the silence became. Even the crickets had stopped chirping. Then they saw it. A house. It stood alone in a small clearing, its wooden frame warped with age. The structure was skeletal, as if something had half-devoured it before losing interest. Vines curled around the broken porch railings, and the windows, dark and empty, looked like hollow eyes. "That wasn't on the map," Maya whispered. Caleb checked his phone again. The app had been guiding them here, but there was no marking for any structure. No roads, no ruins, just blank space. Ethan snorted. "Guess we found our creepy location. Happy now?" Caleb stepped forward, drawn by something unexplainable. The house felt wrong, as if it had been waiting for them. The air inside the clearing was colder than it should have been. Maya grabbed his arm. "Don't. Let's just go back to the car." But Caleb was already moving, stepping onto the rotting porch. The wood groaned under his weight. He peered through a cracked window, expecting nothing more than dust and debris. Instead, he saw movement. A shadow shifting deep inside the house. "Guys," he whispered, his throat dry. "There's someone in there." Caleb's breath hitched as his eyes adjusted to the dim interior. The shadow inside the house wasn't just moving, it was pacing, slow, deliberate steps back and forth as though it was waiting for something. Or someone. Ethan yanked Caleb back. "Nope. Hell no. "We're not doing this." "But there's someone inside," Caleb whispered. "What if they need help?" Maya shot him a glare. "Do they look like they need help?" "No, let's go." A sudden sound, a heavy thud, echoed from within the house. Then another. Like slow, methodical footsteps descending a staircase. The three of them froze. The front door, barely hanging on its hinges, creaked open on its own. Maya stifled a scream, gripping Caleb's arm. "We're leaving," she hissed. But Caleb was rooted in place, his pulse pounding in his ears. He couldn't tear his gaze away from the doorway. Something about the darkness beyond it pulled at him, like an invisible force whispering for him to step inside. Ethan grabbed his shoulder. "Dude, I swear to God." Then a figure emerged from the darkness. At first it looked human, tall, thin. But as it stepped into the dim light, its form shifted unnaturally, like static on a broken TV screen. Its face was wrong, blurred, as if reality itself refused to define it, and it was staring right at them. Maya yelped and stumbled back. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps. Caleb felt his legs lock in place. He wanted to run, but something in his mind, something he didn't recognize as his own thoughts, whispered, "Stay." Then the thing tilted its head. A noise, deep and guttural, rumbled from its throat, somewhere between a growl and a distorted radio signal. That broke the spell. "Run!" Ethan screamed. Maya was already sprinting. Caleb and Ethan tore after her, crashing through the underbrush as the night seemed to close in around them. The trees stretched impossibly tall, their branches twisting together like skeletal fingers. The ground beneath their feet felt unstable, as though they were running on something that wasn't entirely real. Caleb chanced a glance back, and his stomach lurched. The thing wasn't chasing them. It was standing at the edge of the forest, watching and smiling. A mouth that hadn't been there before peeled open, filled with jagged, uneven teeth. It lifted a single, impossibly long finger, placing it against where its lips should have been. "Shh!" Caleb's legs gave out. Maya and Ethan grabbed him, dragging him back toward the car. Ethan fumbled for the keys, hands shaking as he shoved them into the ignition. The car roared to life. Ethan didn't question it. He just slammed his foot on the gas, tires spinning in the mud as they sped away from whatever had been waiting for them in that house. As they hit the main road, Maya dared a final look through the back window. The thing was gone. But deep in the trees, dozens of pairs of eyes flickered in the darkness. They hadn't been alone. They had never been alone. Ethan didn't slow down until they reached the outskirts of town, the warm glow of streetlights breaking through the suffocating darkness. The car skidded to a stop in an empty gas station parking lot, engine rattling from the strain. For a long moment, none of them spoke. Then Maya broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" Her voice trembled, barely above a whisper. Caleb sat in the back seat, staring at his hands. He could still feel the weight of the thing's gaze pressing down on him. He rubbed his arms, trying to shake the sensation. Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, and I don't want to know." He turned to Caleb. "Tell me you're deleting that damn app." Caleb didn't respond. His phone lay in his lap, the Randonautica app still open. The screen, however, wasn't displaying the usual interface. It showed a live feed. His stomach twisted. The footage was grainy, distorted like an old VHS tape, but it was clear enough. It was the house, the broken porch, the rotting wood, the gaping black doorway. But the camera wasn't still. It was moving, panning as if someone was walking through the house. Maya leaned over his shoulder. "Caleb, where is that coming from?" He didn't have an answer. His fingers trembled as he tried to close the app, but the screen wouldn't respond. The camera feed moved deeper into the house, the flickering footage revealing warped furniture, rotting walls, and footprints in the dust that weren't theirs. The camera turned suddenly, facing the bottom of the staircase. Something was standing there, a figure. Tall, distorted, its face still blurred beyond recognition. It twitched, shifting forward in broken, unnatural movements. And then, it turned its head, looking directly at the camera. The screen cut to static. Caleb hurled the phone to the car floor. Nope, we are done. We're done." Maya's breath hitched. "Guys," her voice was small, shaking. She was looking at Caleb's arm. His skin was pale, covered in a thin sheen of sweat, but that wasn't what made her face drain of color. Black symbols, jagged, unfamiliar, were etched into his forearm as though carved just beneath the surface of his skin. The marks were shifting, writhing like living ink. Caleb scrambled back against the seat. What the? A sharp electronic screech filled the car. Ethan yelped, slamming his hands over his ears. Maya clutched her head. Caleb's phone, still lying on the floor, was vibrating violently, screen flickering between static and blackness. Then one last image appeared, a new set of coordinates. Caleb's blood ran cold. Because this time, the location wasn't some abandoned house in the woods. It was his own home address. The screen glitched one final time before the app closed itself. For a long, suffocating moment, silence filled the car. Then from somewhere outside, deep in the shadows beyond the gas station lights, a whisper. Low, garbled, familiar. Shh.